Welcome back to the program, Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. You're listening to News Radio WFLA, or you may be listening to us on our podcasts, which would be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Just named one of the top 25 financial planning podcasts on the internet. So be sure and check us out and subscribe to us. Have you been pitched on the latest hot product in the insurance business? It's a redo of what we saw from the 80s, and it's one of those things where we're back to the future, if you will, where they've brought forward the product that was known well in the 80s as a cash balance type of an insurance product, and now they have it as, back then, it was known as a basic universal life insurance policy. Now it's been brought back and freshened up as an indexed universal life policy. And when we say it's a hot product, it's gone from just 4% of insurance sales 10 years ago to over a quarter of all insurance sales last year. So it's the latest hot product. It's indexed universal life. It's no different than what you saw with basic universal life back in the 80s. The difference is, or at least the hook is, that an indexed universal life is connected to the stock market. Well, guess what happens? If the stock market's going up, then this works just fine and dandy. But the reality is, when you get into a flat or a down market, that's when the trouble happens. Not unlike what happened with that basic universal stuff back in the 80s. Back in the 80s, when you had very high interest rates, people flocked into that basic universal life insurance. And so consequently, the interest rates that was getting credited to the account allowed the cash balance in those policies to grow at a pretty good clip. And that growth then allowed for the cash balance to stay ahead of the expense associated with the life insurance component of that policy. Well, what happened after the 80s? Interest rates fell. And when interest rates fell, the expense deductions continued. And here's the kicker on those types of insurance policies. The expenses, in fact, go up over time. So as you age, the cost of the insurance goes up. The expense that's hitting the cash value of that policy continues to go up. And you wind up, much like many times we see in the office, people in their 70s, 80s, and even 90s still trying to pay on these modest policies that they got back in the 80s, and that they don't want to give them up because they've put so much money into them over the course of the 30 years. But because interest rates aren't what they were back in the 80s, the expense of those policies, because the expense also keeps going up as people age, is literally chewing away at the cash value. And so consequently, those basic universal life policies are presenting no good options to the people that own them or that have owned them since the 80s. Well, it's the same thing with an indexed universal life policy. Right now, sales are going through the roof because, much like in the 80s when interest rates were high, of late the stock market has been doing well, and so consequently they've been getting a lot of attention. Marketed as a can't miss, no risk type of proposition, the reality is that there's a lot of fine print in those types of policies, particularly relating to how they actually credit the performance of the market. Remember, these indexed universal life policies are indexed to the stock market, and so consequently what they do is they allow you for some level of participation. And that's the hook, is they make people think that you're going to get all the upside of the market with none of the downside risk. The reality is, through caps, through participation rates, you never really get all of the market. What's a cap? Well, a cap is simply a cap of, say, 10%, which is a traditional cap that you see on these policies, what that means is last year when the overall markets are up like 25%, you don't get 25, you get the cap, the max, which is only 10%. So you left a tremendous amount on the table. Who was the beneficiary of that extra amount that you left on the table? Oh, well, the insurance company, of course. That's how they do it. The other problem is the participation rate. So the participation rate may be, oh, well, you only get 30 or 40 or 50% of the overall performance of the market. One of the biggest ways that they play games with the numbers is they strip out the dividends of the market. If you do that, then automatically you're only going to get about half of what the performance of the market is over time. So be careful of these index universal life policies between the market caps, the participation rates, and of course, my favorite, on any of these policies, the insurer can change the deal at any point in time. Yes, they have to go through the state and get approval, but hey, you're dealing with something where they can unilaterally change the terms of the policy. And that these index universal life policies work very similar to kind of how basic universal life insurance work. You put the policies in, you put the premium in, the premium goes in, the expense of the insurance gets deducted, and the kicker is, oh, the market went up, so you'll wind up getting a piece of that kind of performance. And then what happens is everything is all fine and dandy so long as you have a decent market, much like as long as you had high interest rates on these same types of policies that were issued in the 80s. But then if things sort of go sideways for a little bit, or in particular as you age, the cost of the insurance goes up much more than what the market is going to, particularly as you start to get into your 70s and 80s. And so what happens is those fees over time that typically get larger and larger wind up getting more and more of that underlying balance to the point where the cash value, you eventually see it slipping away. And then, of course, when that happens, that means you've got to put a whole lot more money in than what you originally had to do, because now the premium is much, much higher. So, bottom line, unless you want to repeat your mistakes of the 80s, which I don't think you do, although it had good music, you don't want to repeat the same mistakes that you made in the 80s. You stay away from this type of product. It's the same product that was around in the 80s. The 80s product had high interest rates, which made it very appealing. The second that story changed, the mechanics and the math and the cost imploded dramatically. It's the same thing all over again. They've just rebranded it, correlated to the stock market, because the stock market has had a good performance period for the past few years. And so consequently, the sales of these products have jumped from just 4% up to 25% of all sales of life insurance. So be careful with it. Stay clear of it, because what's going to happen is over time, the cost is going to increase. And as you age, that cost is going to chew away at the underlying cash balance, particularly if you run into a period of time where the market is flat, or simply the participation rates and the cap rates prevent you from participating in the entire performance of the stock market in the first place. And so consequently, cost keeps going up. You're going to look at that sometime in your 70s and be like, wait, what happened to my cash value? And why are they sending me a premium coupon that I have to pay in some exorbitant amount of money in comparison to what the premium was when I first got this policy? That's how all of this stuff works. It's back to the future once again, particularly with these policies. Stay clear of them. They didn't work in the 80s, and they're not going to work in the 2000s and 20s either. So stay clear of that. They've become an incredibly, incredibly popular product, and we encourage folks to stay clear of that. So that's the breakdown on the latest out of the insurance industry. Those guys are always good to generate out some products along the way, particularly in order to generate business. The latest on the Secure Act, certainly a lot of fine print in there, particularly, I think most importantly, the notion that, yes, the ability to stretch out a retirement account that you've inherited over the course of the rest of your lifetime is certainly gone. And but the reality is that there's some real planning things that you have to work through because there's no required distribution over the course of that 10-year period of time that you must take that money out. You could delay it all until the very last year to take out the total amount of that. Be careful, though. Obviously, that's going to jump up your taxes and certainly a tremendous amount of other fine print involving employer retirement plans, tax credits, and things like that in the Secure Act. So some fine print across the board on that. Remember, yes, they removed the age restriction to make contributions to your retirement accounts, but you still have to have earned income. It won't work. And you are not going to be able to make a retirement contribution unless you've got earned income. Earned income meaning work income, not retirement income, not pension income, not Social Security, not dividend. None of that is considered earned income that allows you to have a retirement plan or to make a contribution to a retirement plan. So make sure that you're aware of some of those changes involving the Secure Act. Certainly a lot of fine print on that. So that's the show. We'll wrap it up and get on out of here. Enjoy the rest of the day. And thanks for listening in to us here at Dollars and Cents. My name is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning and News Radio, WFLA.